Hey, what's going on, everybody? I'm Jorge. Welcome to Fourth and Frames, the flagship podcast here at fantasyandframes.com. I am joined this week by Nate Markham and Brian Ford. Let's start with you, Brian. How you doing today, man?
I was just telling you before the show, this is one of the first night in a while where I didn't have like a million things to do after work and could just, kind of talk about fantasy and that's it. So I'm a little more relaxed and less burnt out than I normally am. But I am gonna be the newbie who doesn't know a thing tonight. So I'm looking forward to it.
Nice. We'll get you caught up to speed eventually one day. For those who do not know, Brian and Tyler Heil here at Fantasy and Frames have their own podcast, the Dynasty 365 podcast, and their live stream airs every Tuesday at 8:30 p.m. Eastern. Go to Apple or Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can download the Dynasty 365 podcast, rate, subscribe, review. Let them know what you like. Let them know what you don't like. All that jazz. And these guys did a great job yesterday. They had Keith and Joe from our other podcast, our daily fantasy podcast, the Daily Fix podcast. Mm-hmm. And they were talking about the fallout from all the big news that we'll get into a little bit here today that happened across the NFL, as well as doing a little recap of the 2022 NFL Combine about players they liked, didn't like, surprised, didn't surprise, so on and so forth. Great episode. Definitely check them out. Definitely give them a follow. All that jazz. Nate Markham, how are you, man?
It's good. It was like a crossover episode. It was like when the Jetsons meet the Flintstones, and they incorporate. I don't know which one's which. Who's the Flintstones? Who's the Jetsons? But it's really, I gotta tell you, I love the show. You guys are doing great.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
No offense to us, Jorge, but I mean, we got to step up our game, my friend. We're gonna have to we got some big shoes to follow from Tuesday to Wednesday, but that's I like it. I like a challenge, and it's not a challenge because it's not a competition. It's just trying to iron sharpens iron, as you've always said, Jorge, or someone else before you probably said that. But
I took it from them, and then I said it. Yeah, exactly.
You just said it a million times, and so I
it's I heard it from somewhere, and then I just took it and used it. So there we go. Originality, yay.
Hold on. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right, and I got the brand new Fantasy and Frames T-shirt here that just got ordered. So looking to send those out to people who participated in the 4Ed championships, made the playoffs. They're going to send them to those people. And just send them out to the Frames crew, get a nice little collection going. Then maybe you could buy it here at fantasyandframes.com if you're interested in both t-shirts, hats, and all other cool stuff here. But we'll get to that down the road. But to answer your question, I'm doing all right. Ready to start talking about some dynasty risers and fallers at defensive linemen. You can always also go back to fantasyandframes.com and look at the risers and fallers at every position, from quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, linebacker we did last week, defensive lineman this week, and we're going to round out our risers and fallers series looking at the defensive backs next week. Articles coming Monday, Tuesday, and of course the podcast and live stream on Wednesday. Some other piece of news that came out this week, which is actually something we're going to be talking about a little bit before we get to the risers and fallers at defensive linemen, and that is we finally adopted an IDP scoring setting here at Fantasy and Frames. And look, there are a lot of good scoring settings out there. I'm not going to say that one is better than the other, even though I'm a little bit biased towards ours. That notwithstanding, Nate and I we're going to get into it. We're going to talk a little bit about it. We're going to talk about why we like it, what sets us apart from other scoring settings. But one of the things, Nate, you and I, we talked about at the Fantasy Football Expo last year when people came by, I think the number one thing we wanted to tell people about Fantasy and Frames is that we want to make sure that, we like watching, when the offense is on the field on TV, we like watching when the defense is on the field on TV. Why shouldn't fantasy football be the same? Why shouldn't you enjoy the defensive component of fantasy football as well? And I think this scoring setting does a really good job of kind of bringing some balance that, people who only play on offense for fantasy football, they might actually start to learn like, oh, well, X player is comparable to this player, and therefore I should assign value to that player based off of, all that jazz. But anyhow, so head over to fantasyandframes.com, check out all the Dynasty Risers and Fallers articles, look at our Dynasty rankings, which are getting updated weekly. here at fantasyandframes.com. And with that, let's get into it. Let's talk a little bit more about this IDP scoring setting here. There's a big caveat that I put at the bottom here of the scoring setting. By the way, Tom Klingsbury, thank you very much for your help at 4:00 in the morning on Saturday, communicating with me about coming up with the ideal scoring setting, how to come up with the ideal scoring setting. And he gave me a really good idea. So I owe credit to him for giving it to me, is that, when creating an IDP scoring setting, because there is no such thing as a unified IDP scoring setting across platforms, which one day hopefully there will be. One of the things you're going to run into is that you're not going to make everybody happy. People are going to find reasons for why they don't like it, and it's going to be like, oh well, the players are scoring too low, and therefore they're not really comparable to offensive players. And so, what's the use? Why do I even have them on my roster? Or you run into people who are going to say, oh well, the scoring settings are ridiculous. I go to the defensive back 120, and they're still averaging 10 fantasy points a game. I don't want that. That doesn't make sense to me. And then you have the people who are like, oh, well, it's too balanced. I don't like balanced. I like to have it one way or the other. So we put out a couple polls on Twitter, and we found that most people wanted to go with the balanced scoring option. But going back to Tom's, help the other day, he said, whatever you pick, you have to understand that every league size is different when you have IDP. Some people have one defensive player. Other people have multiple defensive players. And so if you have a scoring setting that's a bit on the low side in terms of point value assignment per play, then you might want to increase the number of IDP players that you have on your roster to kind of equalize the total IDP output of all the players you have on your roster compared to the offensive players you have on your roster. So with that being said, one of the caveats I have here on the graphic here for the IDP scoring settings here at Fantasy and Frames is the recommended roster size is at minimum 2 defensive linemen, 2 linebackers, and 2 defensive backs. And one of the things we did with the scoring settings is we kind of broke things up based off of the different type of plays and the different metrics that are counted for IDP scoring. So, for example, tackle plays, you have your assisted, solo, and tackles for a loss. You have your pressure plays, which are the quarterback hits and your sacks. You got the coverage plays, which are your passes defended and interceptions. You have your fumble plays, the forced fumbles, the fumble recoveries. Then you got the scoring plays. You got your safeties and you got your defensive touchdowns. At first glance at this, Nate, if you are inputting these settings in your Sleeper app or fantasy, whatever platform you use that includes all these metrics, which Sleeper is a big one. MFL is another one. Well, let's stick with Sleeper. You would put all these scoring settings in there, and you're looking at the rosters, and you're looking at the fantasy point output. What are you noticing right off the bat?
Well, you clumped them into specific formatted approaches: tackle plays, coverage plays, fumble plays, etc. I'm even breaking them apart. I'm seeing them, and they're giving me that jumbled kind of the Hangover with Galifianakis when he's seeing all the numbers appearing, and I'm seeing it broken down into a different format of how I interpret that particular play on the field, and how if every time a play was made and above the player and above the impact of the actual play itself, a point total went bing above the player's head, and you knew how many points they were going to get. For instance, if you see the quarterback get sacked, and you're like, bam, that's a huge splash play, very impactful in the game. The momentum could be stopped. It could create a 3rd and long, 2nd and long, etc. You would say that seems like a play that was worth, about 4 points. Bam, ding, and that's what you see above the player's head. Very, very much just like an interception. Interception happens immediately. The field turns, huge impactful play, splash play, some people will call those, 5 points. So on and so forth. I think that's one of the keys that you want to see is each of the impactful plays has a correlative scoring metric too. And I think that's where collectively, and you did most of it, so I'll just piggyback off you and take half the credit, that I think it's as well put together as a lot of other ones. And I think everybody's entitled to their own opinion as far as which one's perfect. Nothing's perfect, because as soon as somebody thinks it's perfect, people don't like perfection. So they'll just bitch and complain to make sure that no one knows that it's not perfect. And that's the way it is. You were also asking, though, one thing that stands out is I know that QB hits is not a very easily measured, or not easily measured, a very much measured aspect of a lot of scoring. And so that's going to be one that might have issues with certain platforms, but it wouldn't shock me. I mean, as much as we've seen scoring changes, would you be shocked if different platforms allowed for different scoring metrics? I wouldn't be. I mean, it can't. I don't know how to do anything IT wise, but I can't imagine it would be that much more difficult to set up and do so. And if that's the case, I've charted QB hits since 2011 just to see, is that something that we're seeing a spike in? Is it consistent? And each year, the range between player one, or the values like the top 24, we'll say, range anywhere from like the tops being 39 to 40, with an outlier, not even outlier, with a high of 50 to 51, the outlier really being like 33. And the 24th is usually around 18. Let me ask you guys a question. Since 2011, how many people not named with the last name of Watt have led the league in quarterback hits?
2.
Not much different. There's 4 since in the last basically 11 years.
Wow.
Shaq Barrett, Aaron Donald, Chandler Jones, and you have to go way back and Jared Allen in 2011.
Wow, that's taking it back.
Yeah, but yeah, so TJ Watt, JJ Watt, Aaron Donald is pretty much your leaders. So sorry, back to you, Jorge. I monopolized all that.
Not a problem. So another thing you'll notice about this scoring setting is if again, your input these metrics, these values for plays into your app, you'll notice that the scoring output for, let's say, the top 10 or top 20 and total fantasy points scored from last year, for example, kind of mirrors that of the line. So, for example, the defensive lineman's total points scorer average mirrors that of the linebackers, mirrors that of the defensive backs, as well as if you take those players' positions rather and compare them to the wide receivers and the running backs, you'll notice some similar or comparable point values. So now, Brian, you had mentioned last week, I believe, how do you assess trade value in dynasty leagues with IDP players?
Yeah.
This is how you do it. Okay. You have players that score comparable amount of points to one another. You can therefore kind of make the assumption that, okay, well, if I'm going to assign this draft pick value for X player on offense, well, then you could kind of do the same thing on defense.
Okay.
So again, this making everything comparable to offense, I think, is going to go a long way into helping individuals kind of bridge the gap in terms of understanding what the value of an IDP player is compared to that of someone on offense.
So I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
What's up? So the IDP scoring that I've heard the most about and that I think we dabbled with in the charity tournament is IDP 1, 2, 3. So I guess I don't want to get down in the weeds too much because I know we got to go to risers and fallers, but what to you are the improvements over that with this system?
So that is a loaded question.
Okay.
No. It's good if people want to know. We made this scoring setting for a reason. Look, Jordan Raines, fantastic guy who just put out a great scoring setting, great metric, really works well in PPR leagues when you're taking into account the PPR nature of offense. Okay. Well, now you're going to notice that the wide receivers and running backs, their total fantasy output is going to mirror closer to that of the IDP 1, 2, 3 players. Ours kind of mirrors more half PPR.
Okay.
And therefore, since we kind of talk about half PPR on offense with all of our content here, because we want to appeal to both sides here of the standard and PPR crowds, that's why this one was created.
Interesting. Okay.
That's a great way to explain that too, because I think that makes a lot of sense, especially when I was doing my, I was looking at the point totals and like you were telling Brian, how do you match up and do the trades? And you look at equivalent, what's a defensive lineman 2 average per scoring versus a wide receiver 2 or a wide receiver 3, because there's more of them. How do those stack up? And when I looked at the half point versus the full point, I saw that the IDP 1, 2, 3 definitely paired more with the full point. And so, I mean, again, I don't think there's a right or a wrong. I think that it might just be an easy correlation for people that might have half point to say, I'll use the fantasy and frame scoring, or I don't have a name for it. I mean, it could be fantasy and frame scoring, Jorge. I mean, I know no ego driven.
Literally on the graphic, it says IDP scoring. So that's how generic we've gone with.
I love it.
Okay. All right. We'll come up with a name.
Yeah, exactly. I love it. It'll be catchy. Something hashtagable.
Exactly.
But anyhow, so try it out in your IDP leagues this year. If you have any questions about, how many players should I have on my roster, with the composition of the players, should I have more defensive linemen, more linebackers, defensive backs, so on and so forth, always feel free to reach out if you have any questions about why I chose, what I chose for these scoring outputs. I'll walk you through the numbers and show you what you need to see. Either way, we hope you enjoy using this IDP scoring rubric. We are going to be basing our fantasy point talk when it comes to IDPs this year based off of this rubric, which shouldn't be too different from, say, a Fantasy Pros. If you follow the Fantasy Pros people over there and their IDP scoring, obviously it's going to take a little bit of a bump up because we're adding some extra metrics here to keep track of. But where I'm going with that is basically it shouldn't be outside. It shouldn't be too absurd to what you're used to probably in your home leagues. So we hope you like it. We hope you enjoy it. And with that, let's get into some Dynasty risers and fallers.
Hang on, baby Jesus. This is going to get bumpy.
I have to say that this was probably my most difficult pair of articles to write because most defensive linemen that we consider defensive linemen are really edge rushers. So breaking it down, Brian, to the basic aspect of this defensive lineman thing is that edge rushers are your basic defensive ends, and they can also be your outside linebackers. Okay. And so sometimes they line up at different positions where they line up at outside linebacker, or some games they'll line up more at defensive end. So since they kind of have like a hodgepodge of where they're lining up over the course of the year, well, people have just clumped them into a category called edge rushers.
Yeah, I noticed that was kind of new in the last few years. That I didn't really hear of it until a few years ago. Maybe I'm just behind things, but yeah.
You are not the only one who's behind this. There are a lot of platforms out there that have not created an edge rusher position. Talking to you, Sleeper, get on that.
That was my next question. Why not have the position in fantasy? Yeah.
So ESPN has the edge rusher position available. As well as the interior defensive lineman position there available. So you could do it there. Sleeper just basically makes people dual eligible as being a defensive lineman or a linebacker, which can work to your favor or can hurt you if you're going against a person who's stacked at linebacker. Mm-hmm. But the point of these articles this week, I wanted to touch on the true defensive linemen. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about the defensive tackles. I'm talking about the defensive ends. And Nate, I think you can agree that, traditionally speaking, what we've covered here up until this point, here at Fantasy Frame, since we've been covering IDP, defensive tackles aren't really people we talk about often. Sans like an Aaron Donald, who's just a dominant force here.
Right.
Defensive end is kind of where it's been at. You got the pass rushers who get the quarterback hits, who get the sacks, and get the tackles for a loss. So there are different there's different ways of assigning value here for these defensive linemen. But the good thing about this Fantasy and Frames IDP scoring setting is that it helps defensive tackles find value. And so when looking at that, when looking at value, when looking at the metrics, when looking at everything, one defensive tackle that really stands out is Christian Wilkins. Do you have anything on Christian Wilkins there, Nate, you want to talk about?
Oh, man. It's a hell of an answer. That was, if you saw that in the championship game, him doing the splits. And that was actually, I believe, one of my first articles that I wrote for you here, Jorge, was talking about Christian Wilkins as a rookie to target in IDP because of that skill set that he possesses. I mean, he's a big man that can move really well. And now we've seen that. The ability to shed blockers and the ability to get to the quarterback from an interior lineman is paramount. And Miami saw that. They saw that their defense continued to improve when they had that pressure from the inside, which allowed the edge rushers and it gave a little less concern for the linebackers. And we saw the linebackers have a little bit of an issue in Miami as a whole. I mean, they had their ups and downs, but here, the one thing about Christian Wilkins, if you look at it just from PFF stats, just overall, is he ranks first amongst all interior linemen in run defense and defensive stops. From week 12 on, he averaged 16 fantasy points per game. I mean, these are edge rusher numbers, by the way. These aren't defensive lineman numbers that we should be usually in that same breath, other than, like you said, Aaron Donald, maybe Simmons. You can pick out the handful, but he hit his stride. I mean, on the season, he had 89 tackles, which was the defensive lineman 2. He had a total tackle rate of 12.1%. Mind you, in comparison, that's higher than Aaron Donald, if you want to put that into frame of reference. 10 tackles for a loss, which was 18th. Career high in quarterback hits, passes defended, sacks, forced fumbles, arrows lining up for him in every situation possible. And Miami knows that. And they built around him, so you can't just isolate and double team him the entire time. I think Christian Wilkins is one of those next guys that we're going to have. If we have a handful of defensive linemen to talk about, he's the next one that's going to be mentioned amongst the names that I just talked about.
Yeah, no, 100%. His dancing is amazing.
That's what you took out of that. That's fair.
What I took away. He did the worm in the end zone last year, and then of course everybody remembers the splits from the national championship game. No, dude, I'm a huge fan of Christian Wilkins. I think he's going to do amazing things going forward, and it's like you said, edge rusher numbers that he was putting up last year, just amazing. His total tackle rate, like you said, 12.1%. That's fantastic. Again, tackles for a loss, that adds up. In quarterback hits, like we were just talking about earlier, all these different metrics help to bring more value to different positions in IDP, even along the defensive line. Yep. This guy I want to talk to you about, I am super, super high on this guy. If I, in baseball, the expression you're punting at a position in fantasy baseball, because same thing applies, I think, here to fantasy football. I'm going to be punting at defensive lineman because I guarantee you nobody in my leagues is going to know who Jonathan Grenard is.
Okay.
He is one of the defensive ends for the Houston Texans. As you all know, Lovie Smith is the new head coach there. And their new defensive line coach, Jacques Cessaire, hopefully I said that correctly, had this to say out recently about Grenard. Just strength, length, speed, passion. He doesn't stop. He has an incredible motor, great hands. Just love the way he plays each and every snap. That's kind of a good endorsement from your defensive line coach going in to your next season here. In 2021, according to PFF, this is all based off of defensive linemen who've played a minimum of 100 snaps. He graded out as the 10th best pass rusher. He was 15th in fantasy points per game using IDP scoring here at Fantasy and Frames with an average of 11.5 games in 12 games played. He only played in 12 games. Okay, the rest of them were just due to injury. Didn't play with a shoulder injury and a foot injury. He was the DL23 in win percentage. That means taking on offensive blocks and getting around them. And amongst edge defenders, all right, and again, coming back to this comparison to edge defenders, a true defensive lineman in fantasy nowadays does not measure up to, unless you're one of the elite defensive ends, to an edge defender who also gets the tackle upside because they play at linebacker. Even that being the case, he still was the DL7 overall amongst all edge defenders in PFF rankings. Just amazing. Up until week 13, he was averaging 14 fantasy points per game, which had he maintained that, would have had him as the DL7 overall, tied with Saints defensive end Cameron Jordan, who I've heard he is pretty good at football. He is their best, the Texans that is, he is their best defensive lineman. He has been in the league for 3 years now, going into his 4th year. Out of all defensive ends that have played for the past 3 years, he has the 9th best winning percentage out of all of them. He is somebody that you definitely want to zero in on your dynasty leagues, in your redraft leagues. I guarantee you, people are going to be sleeping on this guy, and he's going to be somebody that you're going to see on the waiver wire one day when somebody gets hurt or somebody underperforms, and you're just like, oh, there's this guy, Jonathan Grenard. What's the deal? Should I pick him up? I'm telling you now in March, yes. Why are you still thinking about this? Pick him up on your roster today.
If you go back to weeks just 5 through 8, and you take that little sample of a quarter of a season, and he had 6 total sacks over that 4-game stretch, and these weren't games that he had easy matchups or particularly just cakewalks. It was against New England, at Indy, at Arizona, against the Rams. If I'm not mistaken, and I believe we all can speak on behalf of those offensive lines, maybe Arizona being the lone exception, all above average defense or offensive lines that he had to work to get that production out of. And in those 4 weeks, if you're talking about fantasy points per game scoring, now again, small sample size when you're talking about 4 games, but it's not a small sample size when he really only played in 9 full games throughout the course of the entire season, full snaps and everything. I like Grenard. We talked about him a lot during the season. He seemed to always be in our weekly pickups, our weekly waiver wire ads, because no one really picked him up. It was just, they thought it was a fluke, and it was Houston. So, is what it is.
Well, and that's the thing. Like, what's going to change in Houston this year that's going to take this defense off the field? Nothing. I mean, yes, Davis Mills is a good quarterback, and we can get into the Brevin Jordan love that Brian has for him. That notwithstanding, I think you need a little bit more on offense than Davis Mills and Brevin Jordan to kind of keep your offense on the field a lot. I don't see that happening per se right now. Then again, free agency is about to kick off. You never know. Who knows? But I'm anticipating that the defense is going to be on the field more often than not. So Grenard has definite upside heading into this season. Another defensive defensive lineman, that has risen or has the potential to rise going forward is Rashawn Gary. Green Bay Packer first-round pick a few seasons ago. He's been slowly getting better, and I'm putting slowly in air quotes here because it has been a slow process for him. However, in 2021, he had the second highest win percentage amongst all edge defenders entering their 3rd year, trailing only Max Crosby, which everybody knows. If you don't know, Max Crosby is really, really good at football and should be one of the top defensive linemen taken in your IDP drafts. He has a better winning percentage than players like Nick Bosa, Montez Sweat, and Josh Allen. He had a career high in sacks with 9.5, which ranked him as a DL 18. Total tackles with 46, 2 forced fumbles, and he was averaging 11.14 points per game using fantasy and frame scoring, which had him as the DL 30. Here's the thing. Zadarius Smith, also very good edge rusher. Just bumped him up in my rankings because I totally forgot. Oh, yeah, he's healthy now. He may or may not be in Green Bay going forward. If he is, then this is where the whole could rise thing comes in for Rashawn Gary. If for some reason Zadarius Smith is no longer with the Green Bay Packers, I am super, super excited for what Rashawn Gary can do. He was like on par with Aaron Donald last year down the stretch in terms of pressure percentage. Really good player, really good upside, really good future. Again, whether it happens this year, if Zadarius Smith leaves or goes, that's the deciding factor right there. But yeah, really, really big fan of Rashawn Gary.
Yeah, I am a big fan.
Who do you got as somebody that you're also a fan of, Nate?
Initially, Jorge, I was going to talk about Jason Owe, but since we're starting to really isolate the edge in the defensive line, I can't give him playing for Baltimore that defensive line. So I think I'll include him more when we'll bring back up linebackers if people want to look into him. Look at what he's done over the last 6 weeks of the season. 18.2% win rate. He second on Baltimore with 5 sacks. He had this labrum injury that was nagging him. They have a new defensive coordinator in Mike McDonald, who was with Michigan, but his previous time with Baltimore was more than successful, had some career years out of some players. This isn't a crossover show to talk about linebackers. That was strictly on me. I was so hyper-focused on looking at what some consider the defensive line, and they can get clumped into it. I just got, I focused in on, and it's Odafe away now, not Jason, but it's a name to keep in mind too for the edge linebacker position as far as someone that might be on the up and up.
I got to tell you, I think we're going to be okay because our podcast, our IDP podcast, Shoot the Gap, is going to be kicking off in a few weeks. So stay tuned for that. And I guarantee you his name is probably going to come up more than once, starting with that over the course of the offseason and during the season. All right, let's get into some Dynasty fallers now.
Okay.
Now, my first one that I wrote down hits a little close to home. I understand, not for me, but more so for you. And I it's hard to argue. And I'm talking about Frank Clark, a defensive lineman for the Kansas City Chiefs. Came over a few years ago from Seattle, where he was having a monster year there, monster seasons, I should say, in production and fantasy production. But things have kind of gone downhill quickly. This is not a couple of years ago when the Chiefs were going towards the Super Bowl and winning the Super Bowl and the defense was clicking and Frank Clark was doing his thing. You look back at last year, he finished in points per game scoring using fantasy and brain scoring as the DL73, averaging just 7 points a game in terms of missed tackles, okay, versus total tackles. So his total tackle rate was 2.7%. So 2.7% of all the tackles he was actually hitting. He had a missed tackle rate of 24%. When doing my research, I have yet to come up with somebody who comes close to a 24% missed tackle rate. His solo tackle rate was 1.9%. So not only are you getting the lack of any considerable amount of pass rush from him, because I think Chris Jones has kind of taken over as the dominant force on that defensive line. That notwithstanding, you're not even getting the tackle upside here from Frank Clark. That is definitely not good. And here's the thing that really matters: follow the money, folks. Between now and July 1st, the Chiefs could potentially save between $12 million and $18 million in getting rid of him versus taking a $26.3 million cap hit. He would have to take a massive pay cut to come back to Kansas City. And even if he does, I don't know. I put in the article, I wouldn't even give up a late third or high fourth. Name value is still going to be there. People are going to hear Frank Clark. It's like, oh, Frank Clark, he must be good. Mm-hmm. Or he's good. I've heard of him before. And those people, let him be their problem.
Yeah, and if you you want to talk about recency bias, look at the postseason alone. He paced the team with 3 missed tackles versus a total of 6. So, I mean, you're talking about another 33% missed tackle rate in the playoffs when obviously it's even more paramount. Not that I'm harping and using that as any, woe is me talk, but he did. He just, I don't know, something's not clicking right now with Frank Clark, and I have no issues with them, especially depending upon what they're going to do with Melvin Ingram. We don't know if they're going to try to bring him back or where we stand on. There's a number of pieces KC has to address, and they're good with managing the cap. They've always done, made a nickel out of a penny or whatever a saying is. I think I made that one up, and so that's not real great, but we get the idea. They've done well with money management despite heavy contracts.
Yes, you definitely made that up. Who's somebody that you're also low on in terms of dynasty value?
I'm below low. I'm done. The phrase "put up or shut up" is just shut up, and I can't go anymore. Jerry Tillery. I mean, here's hype. What was he? 28th pick overall. I know he's first round. I'm Notre Dame. I mean, the last 3 years has been bad. Just look at last year as a whole. 14 QB hits, which is bottom defensive line 3, 4.5 sacks. I mean, you're talking defensive lineman 5 in that situation. 6 tackles for a loss puts him as a DL 5 overall. And the average, I mean, he's only averaging 7.5, 7.6 in fantasy points per game, which again is like a DL 5. And then you think maybe he's just unlucky. Maybe he just rates extremely high. And a lot of these guys do. If you look at the sack to pressure percentage and you see these outliers where maybe he's getting a ton of pressure and he's just not getting the sacks. Maybe he's in the right place at the wrong time and in the wrong place at the right time type scenario. Nope. He's just in the wrong place all the time. and it doesn't really matter. He rates as one of the worst interior linemen versus the run. Defensive lineman 78 in pass rush win percentage. So he's not putting pressure on the quarterback. He's not stopping the run. At some point, kind of a la Frank Clark, you think that the Chargers might just be, they hate to because they've invested so much. So, you kind of get a lot of opportunities. But yeah, I can't with Jerry Tillery anymore. Luckily with defensive linemen, the churn and burn around defensive line 2 to 3 is pretty heavy at times. You can kind of find some replacement level players and not take a huge kick in the groin.
We want to avoid kicks in the groin for sure.
Correct.
Yeah. One of the pitfalls of fantasy football is all the groin kicking.
Mostly. That is reason why most of us don't play.
I can't get out of my mind the episode of The Simpsons where football in the groin won Best Picture. Yes, for those two. Is that aging me now? Is that not a thing? Is The Simpsons not popular anymore amongst the kids?
I don't think it really is. I think some of them enjoy it, but I teach teenagers and they don't really get the references I make to anything.
Yeah, exactly. Have you seen Idiocracy?
Nope.
You've never seen the movie Idiocracy? No, you need to watch it. It is a perfect. Unfortunately, it's a documentary of us right now.
Yes, it was.
I mean, not us per se, but it's a futuristic tale of stupidity and how we have just devolved into a bunch of dum-dums. And one of the shows that he watches is Ow My Nuts, I believe is the name of it. And it's just people repeatedly getting kicked in the nuts. And they sit there and they drink their drink because it's got electrolytes, and they just watch it. And it's great. If you haven't seen it, if there's anything that anybody can take from this, is Idiocracy is better than any of this defensive line talk. No offense, Jorge, to our IDP love, but it ranks. It's a riser for sure.
Absolutely. So that's going to do it for the show. Talking about Dynasty Risers and Fallers of defensive linemen. If you have any questions about who to roster on your defensive line in your Dynasty League or to, go make trades for, hit us up at Nate Markham and at Jorge B. Edwards on Twitter. Don't forget to follow Brian at FFJunkie_ and listen to his podcast, the Dynasty 365 podcast that comes out every Wednesday. You can catch the live stream.
Oh, podcast Wednesday. Sorry, my bad. Yeah.
Podcast Wednesday, and then the live stream at 8:30 p.m. Eastern on Tuesday. Good luck with everything, everybody. Hope everybody's doing well, and we'll catch you next week talking about IDP defensive backs.